So, Roberto Unger, Mangabeira Unger, you're very welcome to the Age of Economics. And I'm going to ask you a number of questions about the current state of economics, why it's important, and how we can better interpret what's going on in the world and how useful the discipline of economics is. So the first question is economics really the study of the economy? And if not, what is it?
Economics, for a long time, has not been the study of the economy. Economics has been the study of a method that was pioneered by the so-called marginalist theoreticians at the end of the 19th century. And the application of that method to subjects that don't appear to be economic at all is regarded as economics. And the study of the economy by some other widely different method, for example, the writings of the German social theorist Max Weber about the economy, are not regarded as economics. Mm-hmm. So it is primarily the study of a particular method, the nature and consequences of which I hope we'll explore in the course of our conversation. What is important to understand is how economics exemplifies in a particular way the situation of contemporary social thought. If we examine the whole field of social and historical study, we see that there are three main tendencies in command. In the positive social sciences, including economics, what is in command is the rationalizing impulse, the attempt to explain the established arrangements as natural, necessary, or superior. In the history of philosophy, we would call this right-wing Hegelianism. The real is rational. In the normative disciplines of political philosophy and legal theory, what prevails is the humanizing impulse, the attempt to place a pseudo-philosophical gloss on the homely arrangements of mid-20th century social democracy and social liberalism, and to improve them by the management of the economy and by compensatory redistribution through tax and transfer on the one hand, and by the idealization of law in the vocabulary of impersonal policy and principle on the other hand. So the two disciplines of power, the two normative disciplines, are mainly occupied in this humanizing project. And in the humanities, what prevails is escapism. Consciousness embarks on a roller coaster of subjectivist adventurism, disconnected from the imagination and reconstruction of society. The representatives of these three tendencies, the rationalizing, the humanizing, and the escapist, pretend to be adversaries, but they are in fact allies in the disarmament of the transformative will and the transformative imagination. So the fundamental characteristic that all of these impulses have in common is the suppression of structural understanding and of the imagination of structural alternatives. We think in science, in natural science, that to understand a phenomenon is to understand what it can become. But it is precisely this transformative insight that is suppressed in the contemporary disciplines. So if we go back to the rationalizing impulse and the positive social sciences, what we find is that each of them severs the vital link between insight into the actual and imagination of the adjacent possible in a different way. It's the way that Tolstoy describes family life at the beginning of Anna Karenina. All happy families are alike, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And the unhappiness of the social sciences is their prostration and their aversion from transformative insight, this connection between the real and the possible. Economics is the best organized of the social sciences and the most influential. And it produces this effect of retrospective rationalization in a very distinctive way.
Great. Well, you talked about the method, the characteristic method of economics. So can you go a bit more into that? And what is the trouble with that?
Method of economics, the fundamental method of the discipline that was created in the wake of this marginalist turn of the 19th century is the creation of models, the production of models in mathematical language, against the background of a very special kind of theory. So I have to say something about the fundamental nature of the theory. The marginalists understood the economy as a series of connected markets. The fundamental operation is the choice of comparative ways to satisfy desires or goals against the background of the constraint of scarcity in competitive or relatively competitive markets. As if the main task of economics were the explanation of relative prices, although this method has never actually explained relative prices in any real economy. So that's the background, the fundamental nature of the theory. This theory, as the Austrian economists who were among the main formulators and defenders of it perceived, was not really a causal science at all. It was closer to logic than to causal explanation. And in its purest form, it was analytically rigorous but empty. It was a form of deductive reasoning. So it creates an analytic apparatus that is innocent of factual stipulations, causal conjectures, or normative commitments. It's a machine, and a logic machine. And the gas has to be supplied from the outside. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So when it is rigorous, it is empty. And when it has internal content, the internal content has to be somehow smuggled into it, and it becomes impure. It's either impure and corrupted intellectually and potent, or it is rigorous and pure but impotent. Now, so that's the background, the analytical background. Then the main activity of the economist in this tradition is to formulate different models, which are stylized accounts of a part of economic reality against this undisputed theoretical background. So if a model doesn't work, they change the model by introducing new elements into it or altering the values of the elements. It's like Groucho Marx said, I have principles, and if you don't like them, I have other ones. So this is widely regarded as an advantage because it makes the background theory invulnerable. Something doesn't work, you replace the model. But of course, it's not an advantage, it's a condemnation. And it risks condemning economics to an eternal infancy because it lacks this vital dialectic between theory and fact, empiricism. There is a great deal of theory and there's plentiful empiricism, but they have very little to do with each other in the science or the pseudoscience that resulted from this marginalist turn of the late 19th century. So that, I would say, is the fundamental problem with the economics that resulted from this revolution. There have been many other projects in economics. For example, Alfred Marshall, who wrote and thought in England at the same time of this marginalist revolution, proposed that economics should be developed by the methods of natural history. It should be a context-dependent causal science, like the science of the tides or of the weather. But that's not what, on the whole, it became. So that is the fundamental character of this method. And to understand it fully, we have to take that as just the first of a series of flaws, because there are three other flaws that follow on that fundamental one. So the second flaw has to do with the deficit of institutional imagination in the economics that resulted from the marginalist turn, and particularly institutional imagination with respect to the institutions of the market order itself. So from the standpoint of institutions, you could say there have been three main types of economics. First, there's pure economics, which has no institutional assumptions. It's, as I said, a kind of logical apparatus. And as was demonstrated in the mid-20th century, it can be applied even to a command economy or socialist economy. It's innocent. This is, so the purists have as their ethic the ethic of Pontius Pilate. My hands are clean. I make no commitments. My only commitment is to logical rigor. And of course, this helps explain a peculiarity of this economics, which is that it worships mathematics, but employs only primitive mathematics. The mathematics developed before the middle of the 19th century, because no other mathematics is of any use for deductive reasoning, which is what it mainly does, as opposed to the use of mathematics in contemporary physics to explore complicated and paradoxical types of connections in nature. So, and then there's a second kind of economics, which you could call fundamentalist economics with respect to institutions. So it identifies the abstract notion of the market with a particular set of economic institutions. And this is the belief of the vulgar economists, that a market is a market, property is property, contract is contract. Everyone knows what they are. In fact, the jurists demonstrated over 150 years that the market has no natural form and it can be organized in radically different ways. So in this fundamentalist tradition, we have, for example, the school of Friedrich Hayek. And its assumption is that if Robinson Crusoe traded long enough on his island, he would eventually reproduce spontaneously the whole system of German private law, because it's intrinsic to the nature of the market. And then there's a third kind of economics with respect to institutions, which you could call equivocating economics, in which, exemplified by the practice of the so-called macroeconomists, who are the American followers of Keynes, who reduced his teachings to the theory of fiscal and monetary policy. So there the idea is there are law-like relations between large-scale economic aggregates, like the level of employment and of inflation, Phillips curve as it's called. And if you challenge them, you can say, well, these so-called laws depend on a host of detailed institutional arrangements. For example, whether there's unemployment insurance, or how labor is organized, or who has power over monetary policy and so forth. And then the macroeconomists will concede that that's true. But if he is in a situation in which de facto there is institutional stagnation, he will disregard this concession, this pro forma concession, and go back to what he was doing before, which was the exploration of these pseudo laws. So this is the second defect. The third defect of the economics that resulted from marginalism is that it has no view of production. So it views the economy solely as a system of exchange, mediated through the price system. This wasn't true of the economics that existed before marginalism. For the two greatest economic thinkers previous, Karl Marx and Adam Smith, the theory of production was of equal weight to the theory of exchange. But the economists came to think of the world of production as a shadowy extension of the system of exchange. And so if you open an economics textbook and look at the chapter called The Theory of Production, you'll find that there's almost nothing in it about what we would call production. It's about the substitution of factors or the shape of markets. And this is facilitated because in these economies that they study, labor can be bought and sold, and therefore viewed under the lens of relative prices. The fourth defect of this economics that resulted from the marginalist turn is that it is the theory of a method of competitive selection, bereft of any account of the diversification of the material on which competitive selection operates. So it's as if it were the neo-Darwinian synthesis in the life sciences without the second half. So there's a half about competitive selection, but where's the other half about genetic mutation and recombination? That doesn't exist. And that's a problem because the fecundity of a method of competitive selection depends on the richness of the material from which it selects. So this is like the truncated half version of some undeveloped theory. Now, you'll notice that this is a pretty obvious account of these flaws, but it's not part of the debate because the general public, the complainers, the hostile but confused enemies of economics can only think to say that the assumptions are not realistic, real people are not these economic automatons and so forth. They don't understand what the method was supposed to be. And so the economists can dismiss these complaints that arise from ignorance and confusion. And the real flaws in their pseudoscience are never exposed. They're, as it were, secrets, the secrets of this intellectual empire. And that helps explain this somewhat disastrous situation in which the discipline that has the greatest influence and authority among the social sciences should rest on such fragile foundations.
Great. So you've talked a lot about the flaws, but what do you see? You want to continue to discuss the crucial flaws of the dominant tradition of economics, or have you said enough on this?
Well, there are, so it's natural that one way in which the method is defended is they say, well, what's the alternative? I haven't seen you point to a better alternative. But of course, we reach an alternative through critique. Now, in the history of economics, there are now two main alternatives. One is Marx and the other is Keynes. Mm-hmm. And we should say a word about each of them. So we have a broader picture of the situation. So first, Marx was a great thinker, a philosopher. All great economists are philosophers. when they are not corrupted by worldliness in some way. So Marx's great achievement manifests in his critique of English political economy, which is to say, you, the economists, have studied these regularities of economic law of life as if they were the universal laws of the economy. In fact, they're just the laws of a particular regime, which he called capitalism. So there is this insight that what was claimed to be universal and eternal was in fact provincial and transitory. The insight that the economic institutions, like all structures in society, are artifacts, they are our creations. It's like a kind of frozen fighting. So what are the structures of social life like? You could say it's like a game of musical chairs. The fighting, the practical and visionary strife in history is the music. The music stops, everyone has to sit down. The strife is temporarily interrupted or relatively contained, and the chairs are then the structures. They're the residues. They're these truth lines. That's what's implicit in classical social theory, this immensely fertile idea. But this idea was circumscribed and eviscerated of much of its power by a series of illusions. So first there's the illusion that there's a closed list of regimes in history: slave economy, feudalism, capitalism, socialism. It's a fixed menu, and the parts of the menu are enacted progressively in history. The second illusion is that each of these regimes is an indivisible system. So you either manage it and humanize it, or you replace it all at once. And that leads to a binary idea of politics. So either there's reformism or there's revolution. All of this is false, because real structural change is almost invariably fragmentary. And it can be revolutionary in its outcome, but it's piecemeal in its method, and that's suppressed by this idea. And then the third illusion is that there are these laws, there's a script governing the foreordained succession of these regimes in history. And so we don't have to have a program, a project. History has a program for us. And so this is Marxism. What's happened in much of the world, in the third world, in the developing countries, for example, is that instead of being criticized so that one could rescue the essential insight and liberate that insight from these illusions, what's happened is it's simply been watered down. And the result is a series of confusions. The intelligentsia in much of the world has received an axe from the zeitgeist, from the spirit of the time. With that axe, it's cut Marxism in half. It's thrown out the good part, which are the transformative aspirations, and it's kept for itself the bad part, the historical fatalism. So we see in much of the world, in the intelligentsia, two main currents of thought: the degenerate copies of American-style economics on the one side, and this kind of watered-down, confused Marxism on the other. And there are two different kinds of fatalism and pseudoscience, drowning out this chorus of fate, drowning out the development of real transformative insight. So it's the problem of Marxism. Marxism is not an alternative. One can transform it into something else, but then one has to have an ambitious intellectual project. Then we have Keynes. And what has happened in much of the world is that when the leftists and would-be progressive economists lose faith in Marxism and socialism, they embrace Keynes and Keynesianism. But Keynesianism is a kind of truncated or failed heresy. And as a guide to the alternative, it suffers from several problems. So, first of all, although it is not just logic, as pure marginalism is, Keynes returned to the older English psychological tradition in economics. All the crucial variables in his system, the liquidity preference, the propensity to consume, the state of long-term expectations, are psychological variables. There's no institutional vision. There's no vision of structure. Second, there's no account of production. His economic theory is entirely turned to the demand side of the economy, not to the supply side, not to the periodic revolutions in the productive apparatus that so concerned Marx and Smith and the classical predecessors of marginalist economics. And without a vision of the supply side of production, you can't understand what happens in economic history. The third problem with Keynesianism is that despite the title of his main work, The General Theory, it's not a general theory, even of slumps, of crises, of ways in which demand and supply could fail to meet. It's a theory of a very particular kind of slump, one characterized by the hoarding of saving rather than its productive investment, and by the rigidity, the downward rigidity of a particular price, the price of labor. And that leads to the fourth defect, which is that it is caught somewhere in between being a theory of the equilibrium of the economy at a low level of economic activity and being a theory of permanent disequilibrium. And it has no way to resolve this ambiguity because of all the other limitations, the other three limitations I mentioned. Keynes was very practical. Unlike Karl Marx and Adam Smith, who were either otherworldly or revolutionary, he wanted to shine in his own time and to prosper and to influence. And his activity in the world illustrates the proposition that the worldly are unable to change the world. So his occasional writings, his journalistic writings, are often more profound than his theoretical work. Because in his theoretical work, he chose the approach which he regarded as politically most palatable, which was the control of demand, to avoid all confusion with the dangerous leftists or the wild social theorists, and to do what seemed to be feasible in the circumstance. And so he did shine as a result of this Faustian bargain, but he paid the price for his worldly shining in the relative shallowness of his theoretical views. So this is now a very abbreviated picture of the situation in which we find ourselves in the evolution of the discipline of economics, in which the main tradition suffers from fundamental limitations that are disguised by its abundant empiricism, but it's a kind of flaccid empiricism. And because there's no hard causal core. So there's no real causal view within the discipline of economics. Either the causal views have to be imported from some other discipline like psychology, or they have to be invented ad hoc on the spot. And but this discipline is immensely prestigious and influential. And it has been used then as one of the two disciplines of power to manage the established order, the other being legal thought, law. And adapted to the social liberal or social democratic compromise of the mid-20th century. Now, in that, there is a very interesting intellectual history. Let's return to the example of Keynes, just so we see. Now, we're not talking about theory, we're talking about real people, these theoreticians, and how they deal with their time. As I said, Keynes's theory was a kind of unfinished or truncated, abortive heresy, mainly aborted by the heretic himself, who didn't want to be burned at the stake. So Keynes already downsized his own theory. Then come his disciples like Hicks, who do the little diagrams that are in all the economic textbooks around the world. Then come the American followers of Keynes, who then take this system and instead of taking it as a rival theoretical paradigm, rival to marginalism, they redefine it as the theory of fiscal and monetary policy to manage this compromise of the mid-20th century. And then they call it macroeconomics, superimposed on the untransformed body of marginalist theory, which they rename microeconomics. So what had begun as a contest of two ways of thinking ends up as two chapters in the same textbook. And then that having happened, the defenders of the main line of marginalist economics are able to say, whatever is new in this theory is false. And whatever is useful in it can be restated in our own language. We don't need this, so let's get rid of it. And this goes under various labels, such as the study of the micro foundations of macroeconomics. So we're left with a situation in which we have these powerful methodological tools. We have all these writings, this combination of logic with empiricism, but we don't really have a way of thinking about structural change and structural alternatives in the economy. And we have reason to think about structural change. I hope that can be the next topic of our conversation.
Yeah, well, great. Really interesting discussion of alternatives there with Marxist economics and Keynesianism. But changing gears a bit, what is the most important debate in economics today?
I think the most important debate in economics today, to my mind, is the debate about economic growth. Because why are we practically interested in the economy? So that we hope that it will lift, that economic growth will lift from humanity the burden of poverty, infirmity, and drudgery. It will be the development of our practical productive powers. And up to the end of the 20th century, we thought that there was a shortcut to economic growth. Development economics proposed this shortcut. The shortcut was industrialization, conventional industrialization, what we call mass production or Fordist mass production. So it was the vanguard of that time, the relatively more productive part of the production system. The shortcut to economic growth consisted in taking resources and workers from the relatively less productive part of the economy and putting them in the relatively more productive part. In practice, that meant taking them from agriculture and putting them in industry. Now, for various reasons, this shortcut has stopped working all over the world. And one country after another is deindustrializing. So that vanguard is no longer the vanguard. It's a leftover of an earlier vanguard. Or it is a satellite to the new vanguard. The new vanguard is what we call the knowledge economy. Dense in technology and science-based practice, and turned to permanent innovation. The trouble is that this new vanguard, where it exists, and it does exist in every part of the economy, not just advanced manufacture, but also intellectually dense services and even scientific agriculture. Where it exists only as a series of fringes, excluding the vast majority of workers and businesses. And this insular and exclusive character of the new vanguard then becomes a driver of both stagnation and inequality. So there's the dilemma. That's the most important debate. The old road to economic growth has stopped working, but the alternative to it, which would be an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, seems inaccessible, doesn't exist. And that is then the debate that begins to concern the whole world. That's the most important debate. For that debate, we need ideas that these types of economics that I've just described are not sufficient to explore.
Right. So I think you've told us a bit about the knowledge economy, but what is its future, and why does that?
The knowledge economy, then, we have to understand in this broad way, and it doesn't reveal its full potential because it hasn't spread. The dissemination and the deepening are two sides of the same process. An advanced practice of production reveals its potential only as it spreads across a wide range of economic circumstances. It's arrested, it's quarantined in these, it's cabined in these fringes and islands that I described. So its deeper potential is not manifest, but it does have a deeper potential. And we can understand that potential in several ways. It brings together the activity of producing and of discovering, production and imagination. It requires a change in the moral culture of production. The traditional forms of production are based on the generalization of low trust among strangers. And thus they require and sustain command and control type of organization. The knowledge economy depends on a higher level of reciprocal trust and of discretionary initiative by all who are involved in the process of production. And it has the potential to loosen or reverse what has been the most persistent constraint in economic life, which is what we call diminishing marginal returns. You commit an input to the process of production, the returns to that input rise, they plateau, and then at the margin they begin to fall. Why? And it's because the process of innovation and investment is episodic. It's what the biologists call punctuated equilibrium. The knowledge economy has the potential to organize a form of innovation that is perpetual and that is internal to the process of production itself. And to the extent that it does that, to relax or even reverse this constraint of diminishing marginal returns. So this has vast potential. But to realize this potential, we would have to reorganize things. So for example, we would need a different kind of education. Uh, Traditional industry doesn't really need educated workers. It needs only elementary literacy and numeracy, a disposition to obey, and physical dexterity. But the knowledge economy requires a form of education characterized by the mastery of analytic and synthetic capabilities, by flexible, practical, and conceptual powers that are demanded to take full advantage of numerically controlled machine tools. And it also requires a series of institutional changes in the economy and in the way of organizing the market, so that more people can have more access to the resources and opportunities of production in more ways. Now, there are many models that we have from the past of how we could begin. For example, there's the model of 19th century agricultural extension. The state comes to the aid of the family farmer with scientific advice, with access to practice, so that family scale agriculture can have entrepreneurial attributes, and organizes a regime of what in today's vocabulary we would call cooperative competition. The family farmers have their own property, but they also pool resources, including even labor, to achieve economies of scale. So from those relatively modest beginnings, we would have to start to redesign the market order, so that instead of having a market order that is fastened to a single dogmatic version of itself, we have many ways in which economic agents can secure decentralized access to productive resources and opportunities. Alternative property and contract regimes would begin to coexist experimentally in the same market order. And those suggestions and then lead into this wider debate about what's wrong with the existing market order and what kind of a market order do we want and need.
Very good. Okay, the next question is, what is the best way to think about the relationship between economic growth and the preservation of nature?
Well, let me step back and first, before we go there, to nature, to discuss this further, this question we were just exploring of the problems of the market order, and then take the question of nature as an extension of that larger debate. So I was suggesting that the market order is now crucified on the cross of a dogmatic version of itself, a single form of property, of contract, on the basis of this false idea that the market order has an intrinsic legal and institutional form. Let me explain in a very general way why and how this idea is false. So even at the most abstract level, the idea of a market has at least two dimensions. One dimension is the absolute level of economic decentralization. How many different economic agents have access to productive resources and opportunities and are able to bargain on their own initiative and for their own account. But there's another dimension, which is the absoluteness of the degree of control that each of those agents enjoys over the resources at his command. These dimensions are supposed to go naturally and necessarily together. They don't. The ways in which we can extend the degree of decentralization is by creating claims on productive resources that are temporary or conditional or fragmented, so that there can be a churning. For example, we say the state holds productive resources in trust for society, and whoever can assure the highest rate of return for the use of those resources gets to use them while they can assure that rate of return. In other words, instead of having just one way of decentralizing economic resources, we have many. And we can combine resources and achieve scale without committing ourselves just to the traditional unified, isolated property right. We can create many different forms of property and of contract. As the background to an experimental and innovation economy. Now, under the present form of the market order, what we find is that the market generates a huge amount of inequality. And then the inequality is supposed to be corrected after the fact by progressive taxation and redistributive social spending. But the result of that is that then there's a fight, a tension between the economic incentives and arrangements on one side and the logic of redistribution on the other. The redistribution would have to be massive to fix the inequalities that are anchored in these radical divisions between the advanced and backward parts of production. And long before they reach the threshold to make them sufficient to address those inequalities, they would begin to disorganize the economy and exact an unacceptable cost in output. So that's what happens in the real world. We need to anchor the impulse to equality and inclusion in the way of organizing the market, rather than just to correct the inequalities after the fact through compensatory redistribution by tax and transfer. And one of the most important aspects of that objective is the question that we addressed earlier in our conversation of the access to the most advanced part of production. Will the access be for an elite, or will the knowledge economy, today's vanguard, be for an elite, or will there be a knowledge economy for the many? There cannot be a knowledge economy for the many just by the horizontal vegetative extension of these present islands. It has to be organized, it has to be arranged. Design of the institutions of the market. And therefore we need the kind of economics that is capable of informing such a transformative project. This is not simply an instrumental manipulation of economics, because, as I argued at the outset of our conversation, insight is always transformative insight. And if we don't understand how the actual can be changed into something else, we don't understand it at all. All we have is a retrospective rationalization under the disguise of an explanatory account.
Right. And we were going to talk about nature.
Nature.
Yeah.
So let me begin by characterizing the main temper of preservationism or ecology in the rich North Atlantic countries. The main spirit is a post-ideological or post-structural politics. So the idea is history has disappointed us with the alternatives produced in politics and national politics. So we will seek refuge in the great garden of nature. And then we imagine a series of parks. Now, we need something else. We need to show how the imperative of the preservation of nature, instead of being a way of escaping from the imperative of structural change can serve as a provocation to reinvent structural alternatives in a new form. Let me give the example that concerns me as a Brazilian of the Amazon. William, are you there? William?
Yes, I'm still here.
Okay. So the example of the Amazon. So we have this vast area, the richest, most diverse tropical rainforest in the world in South America, a large part of it in Brazil. How can we give practical content to the idea of sustainable development? Only by developing missing linkages between the urban industrial complex and the green complex. Technological, technical, economic, and legal linkages. And an advanced science-based form of production to mobilize the resources of the forest in a way that preserves it. In other words, that's only possible through vanguardism, through the most advanced knowledge and science-based form of production. It's not possible through an artisanal, craft-like form of production bereft of both scale and technology or science. And that is the kind of preservationist project that should interest us. One that is connected to the structural imperative rather than one that serves as an exemption from that imperative.
Great. Excellent. So that's nature. So the next question is, what should we want from the organization of the economy? What's wrong with the way the market order is organized now?
So we just did a different sequence, I think, of this.
Okay.
But so what do we want in the most general terms? We want, first of all, that our productive powers be enhanced. Now, you know, in the rich countries today, there's a discourse that goes under the label of secular stagnation that tries to give a semblance of naturalness and necessity to the slowdown in the growth of productivity. And it attributes this slowdown, for example, to the supposedly lesser potential of today's technologies when they are compared with the technologies of 100 years ago. But it's strange. How could anything be more revolutionary than artificial intelligence? There's a much simpler and more straightforward account of the slowdown in productivity. And that's the most productive practice is denied to the majority of economic agents, of individuals and of firms. So we want to lift the majority up and equip it with the most productive resources. That's the first thing that we want. The second thing that we want is that the impulse to inclusion and equality, rather than being only provided retrospectively through compensatory redistribution and redistributive social spending, be anchored in the logic of economic growth itself. And that's then the reason to redesign even the fundamental arrangements of property and of contract. And the third thing that we want is that the distinction between work and creation, or even work and leisure, be attenuated. And that work not just be an instrumental and hateful burden, but that it be a way of transforming ourselves by transforming the world around us. And a form of production that enacts the imagination, that is mindful, as part of the promise of the knowledge economy, has this potential. All the great economists of the past, including Marx and Smith, had a vision of the unrealized potential of humanity. And there is the idea, which is essential to our civilization, that the spirit does not simply float over the world, it is embodied, and embodied even in material life. In the Hebrew Bible, God says, I will pour out my spirit onto all flesh. It is embodied spirit. And we don't just think of our material life as something to get over, but as something to transform. And therefore, the fundamental ideal is an ideal of transcendence, of greatness, of liberation, of deep freedom, realized not simply by being excused from work, but in work itself. And these are all the high ambitions that we should have for our material life. But we have to find a way of thinking in detail and in practice about the institutional and structural changes that could make these ambitions real. And this is, in a way, the most profound criticism of the rating methods of economics, that they do not equip us to fulfill this spiritual vocation, this vocation of transforming our material life. So the hard-nosed statistical economists who impersonate what Thomas Carlyle called the dismal science, who appear at the door as the ones who present the bill of the trade-offs. All of that is useful and even indispensable, but it's not enough. We don't want just the science of the trade-offs. We don't want just the presentation of the bill by the bill collector at the door. We want a way of associating our highest ambitions with the transformation of our practical experience. And that's what, at its best, economics has been, and what we should want it to be again.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. We got through all the questions more or less. So thank you for doing this. And
so this last point, it means, William, that it's not enough to be liberated from scarcity so that we can be free. We have to be free in the midst of scarcity. Marx and Keynes, who were so different, shared two ideas. One idea was that we're at the eve of overcoming scarcity. And the second idea is that ordinary work, ordinary labor, is a hateful burden. Once we overcome scarcity, we'll be able to devote ourselves to the higher pursuits, to the things that are sublime. And we'll be poets at one time of the day and fish at another time of the day. And we'll be in a perpetual Eden. Now, it's not true. We're not about to overcome scarcity. Scarcity is perpetually renewed in different forms. But it's also not true that work has to be simply a hateful burden. We should have the aspiration to achieve freedom in the economy and not simply freedom from the economy. And it's for that reason that we should reorganize our institutions and reshape our way of understanding economic life.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Roberto, for taking the time and for discussing these important issues.